A comment I received in response to last week's episode claims that Christianity is ignorant, primitive, and illogical. In today's episode, I want to lift up four important Christian thinkers over the last 2,000 years who help to remind us that our faith is instead coherent, intelligent, and rational. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here, Senior Pastor of St. Philip Deacon in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. Good to be with you as always. Today I want to do a little bit of a reaction or response to a comment from last week's episode. Last week's episode was about C.S. Lewis, sort of my introduction to C.S. Lewis, and also some important and influential people in his life. And, these are posted on YouTube. We also post them on Facebook. And I know, I get it, it's the internet. And so if you post things here, you get used to all kinds of comments. I guess I'll just leave it at that. And that's fine. I mean, it's part of the way it works. So there was one comment, though, that I was struck by. There were a handful that were slightly snarky, negative, whatever. And so this is how this particular one read. Use logic and reason to stop the spread of these primitive superstitions called religions and the ignorance that they promote. Okay? So again, holding up logic and reason against primitive superstitions and the ignorance they promote. And there's a whole lot that could be unpacked there. But part of what I want to say is what exactly is ignorant or irrational or unreasonable about religion? And I would challenge someone to defend that position, because I happen to think, and I've said this many times here, that Christianity is coherent, it's reasonable, it's not opposed to the use of our brains, it's not opposed to science, as an example. That quote for me summarized, and I talk about this a lot in my preaching and maybe also here, it summarized for me a sort of posture in the culture that assumes that Christianity is anti-rational, incoherent, a sort of Bronze Age superstition that is not aligned with modern ways of thought, particularly science. So again, there are a whole lot of things that could be said about this. What I want to do today in this episode, though, is walk through four different individuals over the 2,000 years of Christianity that reinforce the coherence of our Christian faith with what we would today call scientific, or maybe if you want to call it rational thought, okay? And I'm going to try to move through these quickly. They may prompt even more questions than answers, and that's okay. We might have to come back to this another time. But I'll begin. Again, I'm going to lift up four people, beginning with St. Augustine. Augustine lived from about 354 to 430. So that's a long time ago. And as I've said in other places, Augustine's shadow looms large over the entire Christian world, East and West, Protestant and Catholic. And so again, this is a long time ago. And here's what he says. This is a slightly longish quote. But again, this is from the very earliest years of Christianity. He says, often a non-Christian, so someone who's not a Christian, knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other parts of the world, about the motions and orbits of the stars and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and seasons, about the kind of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds with certainty from reason and experience. So he's just ticked through what today we would call knowledge that's been gained through scientific inquiry, okay? And now here, listen to what Augustine says. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel, a non-Christian, to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. Talking nonsense, in other words, about the experience and the reasonable thinking that this person who is a non-Christian has discovered through experimentation, let's call it. So Augustine says, if a person who understands certain things in the world hears a Christian speaking nonsense about those things, it's a bad thing. It's a disgraceful and dangerous thing. And he says, he goes on, and we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. Okay? So again, early, incredibly important theologian saying, as Christians, we need to make sure that if we speak about things that are, again, I'll use the word scientific, it's sort of an anachronism, it wouldn't have been called that back then, but that have been discovered through reason and experience, we better know what we're talking about. Because no one's going to believe us if we talk about other things, if we talk silliness about scientific truths. I hope that makes sense. That for me is a really important foundational point, I guess. Second person I will lift up is, again, incredibly brilliant man named St. Thomas Aquinas. We've talked about him here before. Again, now we're fast forwarding about, 900 years or so. He lived from 1225 to 1274. And I'm just going to quote broadly one of his key concepts. One of his key concepts basically was that there is one truth. That truth is we call God, and anything that we know that is true ultimately points us to that God. And therefore, this is paraphrasing sort of some of his other writings, if a scientific theory seems to contradict the Bible, Aquinas believed that either the science is not truly proven or the scripture has been misunderstood. Okay? So these two things will never contradict one another. And he was humble enough to recognize, okay, if there are, again, scientific truths that we can prove that are discernible, and Scripture or our faith seems to contradict it, that all that means is that we do not fully appreciate or understand what Scripture is really teaching us, okay? And so this goes back to that original quote about reasonable, rational, coherent, and so forth. That's the second one. Third one, and I choose this a little bit guardedly because you bring up the name of Galileo, and people think they know that story, and maybe we'll have to come back to it another time. And broadly, what people think the story is that Galileo bravely proved that the Earth revolves around the sun, and the Church said, "No, we don't take that what you've discovered seriously, and we're going to imprison you." Most of that is actually untrue. The fact that the Earth revolves around the sun was actually floated many centuries before that by ancient astronomers. Copernicus, who lived before Galileo, also proposed that theory in 1543. That's what 50, 60, 70 years before Galileo did, in a book called On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, that proposed, again, a heliocentric or a sun-centered model of the universe. The Church, by the way, was totally fine with Copernicus's teaching this. You can look it up. He didn't have the ability to prove it fully, Copernicus. And this is the important thing, neither did Galileo. It wasn't, the heliocentric model wasn't really proven until later through the work of Kepler and Newton. So Galileo observed certain things. He thought it was probably the world or the Earth revolved around the sun, but he couldn't fully prove it. Also, he was kind of just not a very politically savvy guy, and he made a lot of very powerful people very angry for reasons unrelated to that model, and that was really what got him in trouble. In any case, the pertinent quote that I want to lift up is from a gentleman named Cardinal Bellarmine, Bellarmine. This is written in 1615. And he's talking about, again, the theory that Galileo is proposing without full proof at that time. And he says this, finally, I say, if there were a real proof that the sun is in the center of the universe, that the earth is in the third sphere, and that the sun does not go around the earth, but the earth around the sun, and now listen to this, then we should have to proceed with great circumspection in explaining passages of Scripture which appear to teach the contrary. And we should rather have to say that we do not understand them, the Scripture, than declare an opinion to be false which is proved to be true. And then he says, but I don't think there is any such proof since none has been shown to me. Now, do you hear what he's saying? It lines up exactly with Augustine and lines up exactly with Aquinas. He's saying, look, if there's proof, then we as Christians, he's a cardinal in the Catholic Church, then we as Christians should take that proof seriously and reconsider how we are interpreting Scripture. Up until that point, though, until we have that proof, we're going to hold this sort of lightly. I hope that makes sense. But I think that's, again, a really important note in that Galileo trial, which is wildly misunderstood. Okay, final point. This comes from an article. The headline is "The Church Teaches Truth, and Truth Can Never Contradict Truth," which again goes to that everything I've been saying about Augustine, Aquinas, and Bellarmine. And here, this article actually opens with an atheist again condemning Christianity, saying it's irrational, anti-science, and so forth. Why? Because of the Big Bang, right? And he says, it's quoting, the author here is quoting a video where the speaker in a video declares the Big Bang theory secular, naturalistic. He goes on, he says, it's completely contradictory to the Bible. The two really can't be made compatible at all. Now, I've also seen people on late night television beat up on Christians for exactly the same reason, and they'll use the Big Bang. They'll say, well, we believe the Big Bang, you silly pre-scientific Bronze Age superstitious Christians. What's wrong with you? The problem with that argument is, and I think I've said this before, and this is where this article moves to, is that the Big Bang was discovered and proposed by who? A Catholic priest. Again, you can look it up. It's a gentleman named Georges Lemaître, building on the work of Albert Einstein, who in a paper in 1927 used his own, he was a scientist, his math, to propose this idea of the Big Bang. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, you Christians are crazy because you don't believe in the Big Bang, when the Big Bang was discovered by a Christian scientist, okay? I get a little energized about this stuff. I continue to feel like, and by the way, I'm going to point you finally to the talk on faith and science delivered by Francis Collins as a concluding talk in the Faith and Life lecture series this past spring. I feel like this continues to be a barrier for people. And I guess my modest goal, which I hope I'm accomplishing in a small way here, is to suggest Christianity, whatever else it is, it's not anti-rational, it's not sub-rational, it's not irrational, it's not Bronze Age superstition. It is a coherent, reasonable understanding of the evidence that we have in the world to make sense of what the world is and who we are, all made by a God whose fundamental goal is to say, I love you, and you're important, and I need you to be part of this world that I've created, to be a part of its ongoing healing and restoration. So for my money, understanding that from a Christian perspective makes all kinds of sense. As always, I would welcome your thoughts about this. Again, no doubt this raises as many questions as it answers, and that's fine, and we can continue the conversation. But I really felt called after seeing that comment to at least begin to respond to it here, which I hope I have done in some small way. So again, thanks for being with me, and until next time, as always, be well, stay in touch, and God bless.